No-till planting is a really powerful tool, and I've been using it going back for about 20 years, off and on, actually a high percentage of the time, different methods though. But no-till, the no-till craze now, everyone's trying to get away from glyphosate and chemicals, and there's different crop rotations you can use. But unless you are very strict with your no-till practices, you will fail. And I'm going to show you some failures that we've had this year and why. And it'll make sense, probably to visualize this when we go through this. But no-till is becoming a fad, and for that, and I'm not saying no-till is a fad. What I'm saying is that no-till is a very strong, incredibly powerful tool for planting food plots. It's a great method, but because there's so many people doing it the wrong way out there, it's almost turning into a fad, and we're getting a lot of no-till food plot failures. And I'm not saying that as a bad thing, that everyone's trying. You hear no-till, you want to throw it out, you want to see what happens. And I'm going to go through why I think there's a lot of failures out there and how you can avoid food plot failures, especially when it comes to no-till. Because again, no-till is a very powerful tool. I hope you've checked out the Ultimate No-Till food plots on YouTube. You can just search for that right now. It'll come right up. In fact, if you just type in no-till food plots, a lot of my stuff comes right up at the top on YouTube. And you can start from there. One of the things when we have no-till, the reason we're using the buckwheat during the summertime is because you need a smother crop going into the fall. Buckwheat is the perfect smother crop, and I'm not saying there isn't something else that has the same attributes as buckwheat, but buckwheat is very important to use because there's a low amount of stems per acre. I want you to think about grass, even rye or wheat, very high stem count per acre. So what happens if you effectively put the seed on the soil, even with grass, wheat, or rye, and you lay that over the top, or it dies and it's over the top of that seed, it can be too smothering, meaning there's so many stems per acre that, and we'll show you some examples of this even out here, where we have so much dead grass that was a weed within the buckwheat in certain areas that it smothers out the seed. Now, fortunately, we don't have a lot of that out here. That's a good thing. We have one plot out of 7 plots out here on these 2 lands that we film a lot on and hunt on, of course. And that little bit of brassica, it's our smallest area, had a lot of weed growth. We didn't practice a lot of weed control last year like we should have with glyphosate or repeated tillings, anything. And so there's a lot of weeds there, there's a lot of grass. And what happens is there's a grass mat that laid over that brassica after it was called a pact with our Packer Max and after it died. And so imagine that grass mat laying over the top of the seed, and it's so thick that brassica, clover, chicory, all those small seeds, birchfoot, trefoil, alfalfa, whatever it might be, when they grow, they only shoot up about a 1/4 inch leader at the most. And if that 1/4 inch growth of that immediate germination does not reach the sun, it will die. It'll still germinate. The seed's still viable. It's just not getting sun and it dies. And so I'm actually going to replant some of the brassica today in that area because there's such an extremely low percentage of brassica that's growing because of that. And I'm guesstimating, I'm saying that out of 6 pounds per acre that we planted on that, I would say there's a 1/4 to a 1/2 pound that's viable in that area, and not more than a pound for sure. So I'm cutting it to about 5 pounds per acre and putting it out of light, and I'm going to replant that area. So back to the buckwheat. When you have that buckwheat, then you're going to have a really good smother crop because it's a low stem count per acre. When you call the packet over the seed you've already put on the ground, then that dead and decaying buckwheat, you have to spray it. And when that's there, holding that seed in place, holding moisture, then that buckwheat decays quickly. It's stalky. And again, 4 or 5 inches, there's a stalk every 4 or 5 inches, leaves a lot of open soil. So when it dies quickly with the chemical, then it opens up, it's opened up and exposed to the sunlight, and we get not only great moisture holding capabilities of whatever moisture is in the ground, whatever moisture comes in the form of rain or dew, but then you also get a lot of sun exposure, and we get nearly 100% germination. And we'll show you out here where the buckwheat's the strongest, we actually have the best growth. So when you have, if you're just no-tilling in the grass, weeds, you have high stem count per acre, and you put that over the seed, or you allow it to die over the seed, you're going to have very low germination. Very low germination. I've had actually viewers that have said they've put their seed right in their lawn and to test it. And of course that's going to fail. It's too many stems per acre, it's too much shade, it's not going to be viable. They were getting germination rates down to 10-15%. So I like that feedback. I don't like when someone might say, I've tried this method and it's into the lawn, and that's not this method. But it's a great experimentation. I mean, it's great that they've done that, and you can see the germination rates. No-till, a lot of times no-till, people get confused that if it's no-till, then there's no chemicals. And no-till does not mean no chemicals. Now there are rotations that you can use to build the soil. I used those back in the late 90s, early 2000s, where you're putting rye down in the fall and then you're putting buckwheat in the summertime. I realized pretty quickly I didn't have to use my tractor to till all that up. I could just throw it on the soil. I could crush the buckwheat over the rye, grow it. I started doing that long ago. And then the following spring I can throw the buckwheat into the standing rye, smash the rye, kill the rye, mow the rye, and I could have a great buckwheat crop. So there are some rotations that you can use, but if you really want to have a great herd during the fall, and you want to have viable food plots for the entire season, you're going to have diversity. You can't just have rye out here. Rye is an average attraction. Up in northern Michigan, northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, upstate New York, areas where you have a lot of timber, it could be in Kentucky, Pennsylvania, the big woods too, where you don't have a lot of green growth, then it could be that rye is a great practice where you're layering rye. If you look that up online, you can find those articles. That might be something to keep up with the aggressive nature of deer in those areas where they have nothing else to feed. But if you're in mixed ag and you're in a typical traditional Midwest, north half of the country, whitetails, even extending down to the south, you have to have diversity to attract and hold the deer all season long, and there's no better time to actually shape your herd. So if you have a poor crop during the fall, say for example just rye in those areas, you're going to have very little attraction. And so in this plot right here, and if you've watched my videos, we actually have peas, oats, and beans on this side. We're going to layer it with 200 pounds per rye around Labor Day. We're filming in early August right now. And on this side over here we have brassica. So we can have a huge diversity. It's a lot of seed. Over here we're going to end up with 375 pounds of seed. Over here it's just our brassica blend. We've actually added an additional amount of tillage radish, and then we've cut the overall mix down so that we get a lot of tillage radish coming in right here, and we're going to have great growth. But it all boils back to that we have to kill the weeds that are in here and buckwheat. And if you can see where I'm standing right here, I'm standing in a green strip. This was missed while spraying, and you can see what's coming up. We have a lot of grasses coming into this, even though we had the buckwheat here all along. You can see the buckwheat stalks, half of them are crushed down, half of them have started to regenerate and grow. We don't want that buckwheat in there because it's taking space from the quality seed blends that we want to bring into the deer season. And the buckwheat is great. You know, they might nibble on it right now, but first frost it dies. We don't want something where the first frost it dies. In fact, even the soybeans that we plant late, they'll have their green leaves all the way in through the end of October, early November, if the deer allow them to last that long. And same with our peas. Peas will stay green until they eat them. And then we have the brassica blend over here. We have the rye as the workhorse. It's always there, the early planted oats. So with even this buckwheat method, you can kind of see what happens if, you know, we rolled this, we seeded this just the same. We rolled it with the cul-de-packer, and what we're getting is a mix of weeds, some of the forages that we planted. You can see new buckwheat coming in. We have peas coming in, so beans coming in, but it's very light. And so you have to use chemical with this blend. And we didn't practice really good weed control last year, and so we're paying the price for it this year because We had a few areas in our plots that were solid grass, had a lot of milkweed coming in. We have some smartweed in areas, which is really tough to deal with. And so you can bet that I'm going to use some chemicals, probably early May next year. I'll use a combination of 2,4-D and glyphosate to kill this. And then early June, I'll plant the buckwheat. I expect the buckwheat to be growing into a pretty weed-free area. And again, just because it's no-till doesn't mean there's no chemicals. I'd like to tell you that you could use these blends and just keep rotating and smashing it with a cultipacker or something and use no chemicals. And folks, that's just not going to happen. And when you have small properties and you have small food plots, you have to be very efficient with your food plot practices. I don't want this food plot out here 50% weeds, because that means I probably have 20% crop, 15% crop, because those weeds are going to take nutrients from the crops. It's going to limit growth. And for that, it's going to limit my ability to actually build a herd on this small parcel, to have these very powerful afternoon attractions every single day. It's set that deer movement, and it's going to limit my potential not only for building a great herd, but building a great hunt. You can't have one without the other. So I really want to keep you from failing with your no-till, but you have to use chemicals. You have to use quality rotations. You can not use chemicals, and you're very, very limited on what seeds you could use. You could use soybeans in the summertime. You could go to rye or wheat during the fall, but those combinations aren't going to take you too far, especially in a lot of areas, a lot of small plots. Those soybeans are eaten down to the ground. So that's more the big guys, the big food plots. And the ultimate no-till practice and method is really viable. I mean, this is something I experimented with and played around with 2 decades ago, and nearly 2 decades ago. And it works, and it works really well. It's something that you can expect 100% germination, have to control the weeds. You have to use a viable smother crop during the summertime. People will say, I used this method, didn't work. I'll say, first question is, when did you plant your buckwheat? How long was it in the ground? How tall was it when you smashed it down? And the answer is, oh, I forgot to say I didn't use any buckwheat. And so again, if you're trying to do this in weeds, grasses, wheat, rye, put these kind of combinations in the end of the summer, then it's not going to work for you. I'm going to show you some examples of this, and I think this is a really good way to illustrate this. And I want to show over here on the brassica side, it's probably maybe the easiest. Where we have a lot of grass right here, there's a strip right here that was a lot of grass. It wasn't that we didn't spray it, that we didn't seed it. It's simply that the grass smothers those tiny little seeds out. So all these weeds right here, might have been foxtail, I'm not sure, but it was too smothering for this small seed. And then when you go right next door over here, so we have this grass strip right here, and that was because of a lack of weed control last year. That's my fault, and this won't happen again. And then we go over here. This is where the highest percentage of buckwheat was. So anywhere on this field where there's a high percentage of buckwheat, then we have 100% germination, and the brassica is looking outstanding. And of course, we have the green strip where we didn't spray the chemical, and you know, we have a mix of garbage there, and people say, well, you know, garbage plots are great, but they're not. It's not good to have trash in your plots. It's not good to have goldenrod, ragweed, whatever it might be that deer eat during the summertime growing in your fall plots, because that's just taken from your fall plots. If anyone tells you to do that, don't listen, because you want to have viable, very strong food plots during the fall so you can actually grow a quality herd, a QDM herd. And so if you have trash in your plots, that greatly reduces your ability to have a high attraction area in a small spot and set that daily movement, set those bedding areas that you need for does and fawns next to the plots, and ultimately those bucks behind there. You just completely lose your ability if you have trashy plots. And this is an example of that. You know, you go over there, we're going to show a really good difference between grass and then where the oats, peas, and beans aren't growing that well, and where we have a lot of buckwheat and we had a lot of great growth. So try no-tilling, but I strongly encourage you to look at the videos we produced this year on no-tilling. Look at my articles in the past, look up no-till food plots. I have an article from 2014 or 15 that comes right up on top, and you can see how we put this together. I believe no-till food plots in my 2014 food plot book is chapter 12, I believe. And so you can look at that in my book, in my food plot book. And I've been practicing this all the way back. We showed on one of the recent videos of brassica no-till, we showed some of my no-till brassica plots going back to 2000 up in northern Michigan. So very strong and powerful tool for food plotters. You don't have to use a lot of equipment. And I'll show you when this is growing well this year, this will rival the quality and attraction and value of those planting with the big boy toys that are tens of thousands of dollars. You do not need that expensive equipment to have great food plots. You can find out how and why through these methods, the videos on my YouTube channel. Just check out my food plot playlist. I think I have 50 videos in there. And I want to hear about your great plots. So let me know in the comments below. And I appreciate you watching. I know this is a longer one, but a really important one. And I know that you can have some outstanding food plots this year and especially next year if you follow this ultimate no-till process.